Now we're ready to move on to cutting the buttons, which will actually hold the top in place. If you remember earlier on the table, we chopped some mortises to accept the buttons. Let me do a little illustration on the board to help you see exactly what we're doing. I'm going to actually get 2 buttons out of 1 block of wood. So let me draw that on the board. What we've got here is we've got our block, which happens to be 7/8 in this direction, and then 5.5 inches in this direction. You can add some 3-dimension there to this. It's wider in this direction here, narrower here. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually measure over 2.5 inches from the end, 2.5 inches, and we're going to strike a line across, and then we're going to come down halfway. Then we'll do the same exact thing on this side. We'll actually come over 2.5 inches. We'll strike a line on the underneath side there, and you'll see the lines will cross like this. Then we'll come back with our marking gauge and we'll strike a line right in the center right there. And as you can see now, we're going to take this and very carefully separate these two, and we'll then have 2 buttons. I've got the stock already pre-milled here. Again, it's 7/8 this way, about 1 1/8 inch and a quarter in this direction, 5.5 inches in length. Again, all of these dimensions are listed below in the Resources tab and the cut list and the plans for the table. I'm going to start by measuring over 2.5 inches here. Take this, flip this over, and put 2.5 inches on this side. Then we'll take our square and we'll square a line across right here and right there. Then you can carry that line about halfway to the width of the board there and halfway here. So you see 2.5 inches from the end there, and then 2.5 inches from the end there, and then bring those lines down like this. Now we're going to set the gauge to the center of the board. I'll show you a little secret for that. What we're going to do is we're actually going to take and eyeball the center. So I'm just taking the marking gauge and eyeballing the center with a single point right there and lock it down. And strike a little line. You could even put a little dot. Now what I'll do is simply flip it over, and you can see how my lines are off. Now the center is going to be directly in the middle, and it's much easier to see that now. So now we can reset the gauge to where our point is directly in between those 2 lines. Now that it's set, we're going to scribe a line right there in the center of the board. Keep this setting because we're going to use the same setting for the remainder too here. Now that we've got this marked, I'm going to go ahead and cut down on this line down to this point, and on this line down to that center line. We'll just put it in a vise and use the dovetail saw. We'll cut right down to that center line, making sure that we meet that center line. There we go. Now that we've got these cut, we have to extract these 2 pieces, that is, separate these 2 pieces. This requires a fair amount of very careful precision work. We're actually going to use one of the more precision tools that you'll find in fine woodworking. A hammer. You just simply put that on the edge, tap it there, and there's your 2 pieces separated. We'll do the exact same thing on these other 2 pieces, and then we'll have a total of 6 buttons. Now that I've got all 6 buttons cut, I want to fit them to the button mortises that we chopped in the aprons. We've got to take the clamps off of our table, so let's do that. Now, one thing I want to keep in mind, if you're taking the clamps off too soon, the glue inside can be a little bit wet. So I highly recommend that you leave the clamps on for as long as you can. Let the glue dry. However, if you need to take the clamps off for some reason early, you want to make sure that you relieve the pressure equally on both clamps. The glue will set fairly fast, but if I take just this clamp off here, just this clamp right here, there's still pressure right up here. Because this pressure, there's all this pressure right here, and it could pull the joint apart, which I don't want. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take both of these clamps and relieve the pressure equally on both of those clamps. Just something to keep in mind. You don't want the clamp to actually break the joint apart if the glue was still maybe a little bit wet inside. So just very simply, just relieve the pressure equally where you have 2 clamps. Now that I've taken the clamps off, I see that there's a little bit of glue underneath the clamps where I wasn't able to get earlier. So I'll talk about how to remove that here. There's a couple ways. One is I can go across the grain. Now you notice I have the table secured well. I also have both hands away from the chisel. I don't want to hold it like this and chisel towards myself. So I've got my fingers away from that cutting edge, and I'm working across the grain with a sharp chisel, just paring the glue. You can also come in like this and cut the glue away as well. So just be careful. Make sure the chisel's sharp. I've cut in like that. Now I'm just going to come across and clean that up. You can even come in like this and join the 2 together like that. If you've got a little glue that ran down the leg, or maybe a few marks left from the clamps or something, you can simply take a card scraper and just scrape that away. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and fit the buttons to the mortises. What we'll do is we just turn the table over and take the button and make sure that it fits inside the mortise, and it does. That one fits nicely. Let's test all of them. Sometimes they will be a little tight and you've got to trim them down. As long as they fit inside the mortise, you should be fine. Test a couple of them. They all fit well. If you have one that's a little bit tight, then you can actually trim it with the chisel. So you can take your chisel and even just go straight down over the top like this. Straight down, just like that. So the fitting process is just like this. Just make sure that they fit in there. The last thing that we want to do to the button is to drill a pilot hole. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to screw the top on through the button. Now, why wouldn't I just screw the top directly on here? Well, one, you'd have an unsightly screw hole through the top. You don't want to glue it down because of the wood expansion and contraction, but that's the reason for the buttons. When you put the button on here, we'll actually put a screw through the button, and that secures the top in place. That still allows the top to be able to expand and contract. That's why I made the mortises a little bit wider so the buttons can have room to be able to move within the mortise. What I want here is I want to drill a hole to be able to allow an 1.5" screw to be able to pass through that hole. So I'm going to drill a hole here to allow that screw to pass through. 11/64 bit or a 3/16 bit works well for this. I'm going to use a number 8 by 1.5" wood screw. Now that I've drilled the holes to be able to allow the screw to pass through, you see how the screw just passes through right there? I want to countersink it so that the head is recessed. This is actually going to go in like this, so I'm going to recess this side of the button. Got a little countersink bit, we'll chuck it up in our cordless drill. And we'll countersink it. That allows the head to be able to go nice and flush with the surface. We'll do the same thing on the remainder of the buttons, and then we'll be ready to attach the top. Before I attach the top, I want to take one quick look at the top rim of the aprons. I see a little glue right there. I'm going to take that off and make sure we have a good flat surface. Let's clamp it in the vise. We'll carefully remove the glue. And I notice that I have a couple little aprons that are a little higher. A hand plane can level that. Again, I'm cautious here of the grain orientation. Thinking about the grain, which way is that grain going on the legs? I'm working in and then stopping before I blow out the grain right there. Now we're ready to attach it to the top.